Jamal Carter ran his hand over the last box of cereal, aligning it perfectly on the shelf at Emerson's Market. The bright packaging glistened under the fluorescent lights, forming a neat row that spoke to his diligence. It had been a long shift, 8 hours of unloading crates, stocking shelves, and assisting customers with patient smiles. But as the youngest employee at the store, and one who Mr. Emerson himself called the most hard-working kid on the block, Jamal took pride in his work. "You've done it again, Jamal," Mr. Emerson's voice, warm and rich like the morning sun, carried down the aisle. He was a stocky man in his 60s, with a face creased by years of smiles and hard work. "You're the only one who gets these shelves just right." "Thank you, son." "Thank you, sir," Jamal responded, his voice steady with the respect his late mother had instilled in him. A flicker of pain crossed his chest at the thought of her, but he pushed it aside, focusing on Mr. Emerson's approving nod. "It's getting late, kid. Your grandma's probably wondering where you are." Jamal glanced at the clock, 8:45 p.m. The sky outside was already bruised with twilight hues, oranges fading into purples and deep blues. "You're right. I'd better head out." He gathered his worn backpack from the staff room, the fabric frayed at the edges, but still holding strong. Counting out his tips from the day, Jamal was pleasantly surprised to find he'd earned $12, solid for a Thursday night. Every penny counted toward his college fund, even if the scholarship letter from State University had already promised to cover most of his tuition. There were books, food, and other expenses to consider, and he'd vowed not to burden Grandma Ella with any more than she already bore. The cool night air brushed against Jamal's face as he stepped outside, a gentle reminder of summer slowly giving way to fall. The small town of Millstone was quiet, with most shops already dark. His mother's old Honda Civic, a relic of past years and love, sat waiting for him in the lot. The engine hummed faithfully as he started it, a reassuring sound that had carried him home countless times. The route home was familiar. Down Main Street, past Millstone Park, where he'd once played basketball with friends, and then onto Palmer Road, a stretch of asphalt that wound through the edges of town, flanked by old oaks that whispered secrets in the breeze. Jamal's thoughts drifted to the acceptance letter on his desk, his dreams crystallizing with each shift, each dollar saved. Suddenly, the glow of red and blue lights pierced his rearview mirror, snapping him back to the present. His heart thudded, a drumbeat of anxiety. He signaled, pulled over smoothly, and turned off the engine, remembering every word his mother had told him. "Stay calm. Hands visible. Speak respectfully." The gravel crunched under the heavy steps of Officer Barnes. Jamal had seen him around town, thick-set, with eyes as cold as steel and a perpetual sneer. Stories about him had floated through the community like whispers, warnings of unjust encounters that left people shaken. "License and registration," Barnes demanded, his voice a sharp edge cutting through the night. The flashlight in his hand illuminated Jamal's face, making him squint. "Yes, sir," Jamal said, reaching slowly for his wallet. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "You rolled through that stop sign back there," Barnes replied, a glimmer of satisfaction dancing across his lips. Jamal's pulse quickened. He knew he'd made a full stop. Still, he kept his voice steady. "I'm sorry if it seemed that way, sir. I always try to be careful." "Out of the car!" Barnes snapped, his hand resting menacingly on the holster at his belt. The night air turned colder as Jamal opened the door and stepped out, his hands trembling slightly. He was ordered to spread his legs and place his hands on the hood. His cheeks flushed as cars slowed to pass, their headlights casting judging glares that carved into him. Barnes's hands roamed over him, rough and unkind, finding nothing. The search of the car that followed was no better. Upturned seats, the glove compartment rifled through. Everything that spoke of Jamal's careful life disturbed. When Barnes returned, empty-handed and with an expression of irritation, Jamal barely dared to breathe. "Consider this a warning," Barnes spat, tossing Jamal's keys onto the ground. The metallic clink echoed in the silence. "I'll be watching you." As Barnes walked away, Jamal felt the weight of shame press into his chest, heavy and unforgiving. He bent to pick up his keys, the rough asphalt scraping against his skin. Before he could stand, a voice called out from a passing car. "Jamal?" Mrs. Thompson, an older woman from the neighborhood known for her fierce spirit, pulled over, her eyes wide with worry. She rolled down her window, the concern in her voice wrapping around him like a lifeline. "What on earth happened?" Jamal took a shaky breath, the relief of being seen mixing with lingering humiliation. "It's a long story, Mrs. Thompson," he said, voice cracking. "Get in." "We'll talk on the way," she said firmly. The sound of support in her voice was enough to make the knot in his throat loosen. As they drove, Jamal recounted what had happened, and Mrs. Thompson's expression darkened with each word. "Enough is enough," she muttered, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "This town needs to know what's going on. They need to hear your story." As they turned into the driveway of Grandma Ella's small house, the familiar porch light cast a warm, welcoming glow. Mrs. Thompson's eyes, sharp with determination, met his. "Rest tonight, Jamal. But tomorrow, we're making sure no one forgets what happened to you." Jamal nodded, a mix of exhaustion and something new, something that felt like hope settling in his chest. He walked up the porch steps, into the comforting embrace of home, and knew that this night was only the beginning. The following morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Jamal's room, casting a soft glow across the worn desk where the scholarship letters still sat, half buried beneath notebooks and study guides. The events of the night before replayed in his mind like an unwelcome loop. He could still feel the cold press of the hood beneath his palms and the sting of Officer Barnes's voice laced with disdain. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Jamal, breakfast is ready," Grandma Ella's voice called, kind but laced with a tension he hadn't heard before. She knew something was wrong, she always did. He got up, running a hand through his hair before heading to the kitchen. The smell of sizzling bacon mingled with the sweet aroma of syrup. Grandma Ella, a pillar of warmth and strength, stood at the stove, her silver hair pinned back in a neat bun. Her eyes, usually bright, flickered with concern as she looked at him. She set a plate down, her hand brushing his arm. "Mrs. Thompson called this morning," she said softly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "She told me what happened." Jamal dropped his gaze to his plate, a wave of embarrassment washing over him. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I didn't want you to worry." Grandma Ella reached across the table, her fingers warm and steady on his hand. "Boy, you listen to me. You don't ever apologize for being treated unfairly. We're going to do something about this, you hear?" Jamal nodded, the weight of her words settling into the spaces where fear had been. Before he could respond, there was another knock at the door. This time it was sharp and purposeful. Grandma Ella rose, her back straightening like a soldier's. When she opened the door, Mrs. Thompson stood there, her eyes fierce and her arms crossed over her chest. "Good morning, Ella," she said briskly, casting a sympathetic glance at Jamal. "I've already spoken to some folks. The whole neighborhood is going to hear about this. We need to make noise if we want change." Grandma Ella nodded. "Come in, Helen. Let's talk about what we need to do." By afternoon, news had already begun spreading through Millstone. Neighbors whispered on porches, phones buzzed with messages, and posts appeared on social media detailing what had happened to Jamal. His phone lit up with notifications, texts from classmates, co-workers from Emerson's Market, even people he hadn't spoken to in years. One message from his friend Jerome stood out. "Bro, the whole town is talking. We've got your back." Mrs. Thompson had wasted no time. With the conviction of someone who had fought many battles in her life, she reached out to community leaders and organized a meeting at the local community center. By late afternoon, the halls of the center were abuzz with voices, some angry, others curious, all concerned. Jamal sat in the back of the room, flanked by Grandma Ella and Mrs. Thompson. The room was packed, filled with familiar faces from church, school, and the neighborhood. Mr. Emerson stood near the front, arms folded and a frown creasing his forehead. Even the local pastor, Reverend Collins, was there, his face solemn but hopeful. Mrs. Thompson walked to the front of the room and cleared her throat. Silence fell like a blanket. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "What happened to Jamal Carter isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern we can no longer ignore." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jamal felt his pulse quicken as eyes turned toward him, some filled with empathy, others with quiet anger. Reverend Collins stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Mrs. Thompson's shoulder. "We are here to seek justice, not just for Jamal, but for every person in this town who has been made to feel small, afraid, or alone. And we will do so peacefully, but we will be heard." Jamal's throat tightened as he looked out over the crowd. It was overwhelming, seeing so many people come together on his behalf. Grandma Ella's hand rested lightly on his arm, her silent strength urging him forward. "Jamal," Mrs. Thompson called, "would you like to say a few words?" The room went silent again, the weight of expectation pressing on him. He stood slowly, heart hammering. I just want to thank everyone for being here," he began, his voice shaky, but gaining strength as he continued. "What happened to me isn't just about one bad night. It's about making sure no one else has to feel the way I did. Scared, humiliated, powerless. We deserve better. We need better." Applause erupted, raw and emotional. Jamal sank back into his seat, breathless, as a wave of relief and determination washed over him. The next few days passed in a blur. The town seemed split in two, those who stood with Jamal and those who questioned the story, holding on to doubt out of loyalty to the police or fear of change. Online, comments ranged from supportive to toxic. But despite the noise, momentum built. Calls for the release of Officer Barnes's body camera footage grew louder, echoing in City Hall and local newsrooms. One evening, as Jamal was heading home from work, Mrs. Thompson pulled up alongside him in her old sedan. "Hop in, Jamal. We're going to City Hall." "What? Now?" Jamal asked, surprise and nervousness warring within him. "Yes, now. The City Council is holding an emergency meeting, and we're going to make sure they hear us." The council chamber was packed, with every seat taken and people standing in the aisles. Council members sat at the front, their faces unreadable, while murmurs filled the room. Officer Barnes was there too, his expression a mix of arrogance and discomfort. Jamal sat near the front, flanked by Mrs. Thompson and Grandma Ella. When the council president, a stern man with salt and pepper hair, called for public statements, Mrs. Thompson stood first. "I am Helen Thompson," she said, her voice ringing through the chamber, "and I demand that Officer Barnes's body camera footage from that night be reviewed and released to the public." A murmur swept through the room, punctuated by nods and whispers of agreement. The council president exchanged glances with the police chief, who sat with his jaw clenched. Reverend Collins rose next. "We're not here to incite anger. We're here for justice, for transparency. This community deserves to know that the people sworn to protect them are held to the highest standard." The police chief cleared his throat, stepping up to the microphone. His expression was carefully neutral. "We hear your concerns. We will begin an internal review immediately." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed, and Jamal's heart sank. He knew the words were meant to pacify, not to promise action. But as he scanned the room, he saw determination on the faces of those who had gathered. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The following day, headlines blared across the town's local news site. "Community demands police accountability following teen's unjust encounter." The pressure mounted. Reporters called Jamal's house, and friends sent messages of encouragement. Even Mr. Emerson stopped him at work, patting him on the shoulder and saying, "We're all proud of you, kid." Then a breakthrough came. Late one evening, as Jamal was reading through supportive comments and steeling himself against the negative ones, a call came from Mrs. Thompson. "Turn on Channel 6, Jamal," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. He did, and there on the screen, the anchor announced police body camera footage related to the incident involving local teen Jamal Carter is set to be reviewed and released. Following significant community pressure, a small, tentative smile tugged at the corners of Jamal's mouth. It wasn't the end, but it was progress. Jamal felt the tension coursing through his body as he sat at his desk, the glow of the television casting long shadows across his room. The news report that the body camera footage would be reviewed sent a ripple of anticipation through the community. People from all corners of Millstone, those who had quietly endured and those who had vocally protested, felt the weight of this announcement. It was more than just a piece of footage. It was a test of whether justice could really be served in a place that had often failed to uphold it. The following morning, Grandma Ella's house was buzzing with visitors. Mrs. Thompson arrived early, her determination etched into every line of her face. She brought news from the neighborhood, stories of others who had faced similar encounters with Officer Barnes. One by one, these stories began to form a web of incidents that painted a damning portrait of systemic issues. The shared stories weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices growing louder, gaining momentum. "Jamal, are you ready for what's to come?" Mrs. Thompson asked, as she set a steaming cup of tea on the table in front of him. He looked up, the weight of her question settling into his chest. "I think so, Mrs. Thompson. I don't know if I'll ever be fully ready, but I know it has to be done." Grandma Ella, who had been listening quietly, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, child. You have us. You have this whole community behind you." That morning, Jamal decided to step into the storm with open eyes. He composed a statement, aided by Mrs. Thompson and a few close friends, and shared it on social media. The post read, "What happened to me was wrong, but I'm not the only one it's happened to. This fight is for everyone who has ever felt powerless. Thank you to everyone who's standing with me. We won't back down." The post went viral within hours, shared not only by friends, but by people who resonated with his story, and those who believed in justice. The local paper picked up on it, and soon even regional news stations reached out for interviews. The town of Millstone was in the spotlight, and the battle for truth had officially begun. The days that followed were a mix of highs and lows. Some people called Jamal brave. Others labeled him a troublemaker, accusing him of trying to tarnish the reputation of the police force. The tension in town was palpable. Stores became quieter as people whispered behind counters, and conversations in the park turned from casual to intense. One evening, while Jamal was helping Grandma Ella in the garden, the phone rang. It was Reverend Collins. "Jamal, we need to talk," he said, his voice deep with urgency. "There's a town meeting tomorrow evening, and I think it's important you attend." "Of course, Reverend," Jamal replied, a mix of anticipation and anxiety tightening his throat. The town meetings had always been gatherings of debate and decision, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, and the outcome would impact far more than just him. The community center was full to capacity the next evening, the air thick with expectation. Rows of folding chairs lined the room, occupied by faces both familiar and new. Jamal stood near the back, hands clasped together to still their trembling. Mrs. Thompson was beside him, eyes scanning the crowd with the sharpness of a hawk. Grandma Ella, seated in the front row, nodded to him reassuringly. Mayor Caldwell, a tall man with a salt-and-pepper beard and a politician's practiced smile, called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We are here to address the concerns raised by recent events involving one of our own, Jamal Carter, and Officer Barnes. The review of the body camera footage is underway, but tonight we're here to hear from the community." A murmur swept through the room as people exchanged glances. The first to speak was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman whose quiet demeanor often went unnoticed. "I don't know Jamal well," she began, her voice steady, "but I know what it's like to feel afraid. My grandson was stopped last year by the same officer, and I remember the fear in his eyes when he told me." Her words were a catalyst. One by one, others stood up, each adding their own piece to the story. The tales shared were not just about Officer Barnes. They were about a system that had, for too long, allowed power to be wielded without oversight. The room crackled with emotion, with raw, collective truth. Finally, Reverend Collins gestured for Jamal to speak. The room fell silent, eyes and camera lenses focused on him. He stepped forward, his heart pounding like a drum. He took a deep breath, feeling the strength of those who had spoken before him. "What happened to me is something that shouldn't happen to anyone," Jamal said, his voice clear but heavy with emotion. "This isn't just about one encounter or one officer. It's about how we treat each other, how we trust those who are meant to protect us. We need to be better. And that starts with making sure everyone is held accountable, no matter their position." A wave of murmurs swept the room, followed by scattered applause. The mayor nodded slowly, the serious expression on his face hinting that he was taking everything in. The meeting continued late into the night, with both supporters and skeptics voicing their thoughts. But one thing was clear. The call for change had been amplified. The day the body camera footage was released, Jamal woke up to a mix of nerves and anticipation. The town had been buzzing with speculation, and now the moment had come. The video, made public on the local police department's website, was raw and unsettling. It showed Officer Barnes approaching Jamal's car, his demeanor aggressive from the start. The recording captured the officer's tone, the tension in his body language, and the unnecessary escalation. It confirmed what Jamal had said all along. Grandma Ella sat beside Jamal as they watched the footage, her jaw tight. Tears brimmed in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief that the truth was now visible to everyone. By midday, reactions poured in. Messages flooded Jamal's phone. News vans lined the streets, and reporters sought interviews. Mrs. Thompson stopped by, her face flushed with the satisfaction of vindication. "They can't deny it now," she said, a rare smile breaking through her usually serious expression. "This is just the beginning, Jamal." But with the truth out, resistance came swiftly. Protests both supporting and opposing the revelations erupted. Signs with messages like "Justice for Jamal" were met with others reading "Support our police." The divide that had once been subtle was now unmistakably visible. Despite the tension, Jamal felt something stir within him. Something bigger than fear or anger. It was resolve. The battle was far from over, but he knew he wasn't standing alone. As the days turned into weeks, the town of Millstone became the epicenter of a larger conversation. The footage of Officer Barnes's encounter with Jamal had sparked more than local whispers. It caught the attention of regional media, advocacy groups, and state officials. What had started as a single night's injustice was evolving into a battle over trust, reform, and change. Jamal found himself at the heart of this movement, a position he had never sought but accepted with growing determination. The community center became the unofficial headquarters of the movement, where neighbors, friends, and new allies gathered to strategize. The room, once reserved for birthday parties and civic meetings, now echoed with discussions about policy, rights, and hope. One evening, Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the room, a large whiteboard behind her covered in lists and notes. "We need to keep the pressure on," she said, pointing to the next steps outlined in neat, looping handwriting. "The City Council is planning a hearing on police practices next month. That's where we'll push for real change." Jamal sat in the front row, next to Grandma Ella, who had taken on the role of silent sentinel in his journey. Her presence was a constant reminder of why he was fighting, not just for himself, but for every kid in Millstone who looked out at the world with both hope and apprehension. After the meeting, as people mingled and shared ideas, Jamal found himself in conversation with Sarah, a college student who had returned to Millstone after hearing about the situation. She was passionate, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of youth coupled with the sharpness of someone well-read and ready for debate. "You know, Jamal, this could be a turning point," she said, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "I've been studying cases like this in school. What we're doing here could set a precedent for other towns dealing with the same issues." Jamal nodded, the weight of responsibility pressing against him, but also fueling him. "It has to be more than just a story that fades," he replied. "People are watching. We can't let this moment pass without making something real happen." The following week, the first signs of fall began to creep into the air. Leaves turned to shades of amber and crimson, and the town's landscape transformed into a patchwork of color. But despite the beauty of the season, the tension in Millstone remained palpable. The police department announced that Officer Barnes had been suspended without pay pending an official review. It was a move meant to placate the public, but for many, it was not enough. Jamal woke one morning to find that someone had painted graffiti across the side of the grocery store where he worked. The words "Stay Silent" were scrawled in harsh black strokes. Mr. Emerson, upon seeing it, cursed under his breath before turning to Jamal with a stern, reassuring look. "They think this will scare you off?" Mr. Emerson said, shaking his head. "They don't know the first thing about you, kid. We'll clean this up together." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jamal and Mr. Emerson scrubbed at the walls, their hands stained with soap and paint thinner. Cars slowed as they passed, some drivers nodding in support, others avoiding eye contact. The silent exchange was another reminder that not everyone in Millstone saw the situation through the same lens. Despite the challenges, the community pushed forward. Fundraisers were held to support legal fees and awareness campaigns. A local band even put together a benefit concert at the town's park, with proceeds going toward advocacy work. The event drew a large crowd, and as music floated into the evening air, Jamal walked among his friends and neighbors, feeling, for the first time in a while, the stirrings of hope. Mrs. Thompson took the stage halfway through the concert, her voice rising above the chatter. "This isn't just about one boy or one incident," she said. "It's about reminding ourselves what kind of town we want to be. A place where our children can grow up safe. A place where we can trust those sworn to protect us. Tonight, we stand together, not as sides of an argument, but as one community demanding better." The applause that followed was thunderous, a unified cry in the dark. Jamal felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He looked around and caught sight of Reverend Collins, who gave him a nod and mouthed, "You're doing good, kid." But not every moment was met with applause. The backlash from those who viewed Jamal's actions as an attack on the police was growing. One afternoon, as he walked to the market, he passed a small group of protesters holding signs that read, "Support our officers," and "No to mob justice." Their presence was a stark reminder that not everyone saw this fight as righteous. One of the men, burly and red-faced, called out, "Jamal! Why don't you tell us what really happened that night?" Jamal paused, a cold rush of adrenaline coursing through him. He met the man's gaze, refusing to look away. "The truth is out there," he said calmly, gesturing toward the police department. "You just have to be willing to see it." The man muttered something under his breath, but Jamal turned away before he could hear. He didn't need the confrontation. He needed to stay focused. As the date of the council hearing approached, tensions reached a boiling point. News crews arrived from larger cities, setting up their vans along Main Street. The local diner buzzed with conversations split between those who were proud of Jamal and those who thought the whole thing had gone too far. Grandma Ella's house became a haven for people seeking advice or sharing their stories. One evening, an unexpected knock on the door revealed a young police officer, his uniform pressed and his face conflicted. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice tight with nerves. Jamal exchanged a glance with his grandmother before nodding. The officer introduced himself as Officer Reyes, one of the newer recruits on the force. He shifted awkwardly, glancing at the photographs on the mantel, snapshots of Jamal's childhood, moments of joy frozen in time. "I just wanted you to know," Reyes began, clearing his throat, "not all of us agree with what happened that night. I didn't come here as a cop. I came as someone who believes in doing what's right." Jamal felt a mix of surprise and gratitude wash over him. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. Reyes nodded, his expression softening. "I hope this town can find a way to heal, and I hope you know that there are people on both sides who want the same thing. Real change." When the officer left, Grandma Ella turned to Jamal, her eyes shining with pride. "It's not just us anymore," she said softly. "Even those who wear the badge see that this isn't just black and white. It's about what's right." The night before the council hearing, Jamal sat in his room, his fingers hovering over the keys of his phone. Messages from classmates, friends, and strangers flooded his inbox. Some offered support, while others spouted threats or accusations. He ignored the latter, focusing instead on the words of encouragement. He scrolled until he found a message from Sarah, the college student who had become a key part of the movement. Tomorrow's going to be tough, but remember why you started this. We're all with you. Taking a deep breath, Jamal typed back, I know. Thanks for reminding me. The morning of the city council hearing arrived with a quiet, tense energy that settled over Millstone like a heavy fog. Jamal woke before sunrise, staring at the gray sky through his window. The street below was still and silent, the town holding its breath. He dressed in his best clothes, a crisp white shirt and a dark tie borrowed from Reverend Collins. It was the first time he'd worn it, but today called for something more than his usual attire. As he came into the kitchen, Grandma Ella handed him a plate of eggs and toast. She didn't speak at first, but when Jamal sat down, she placed a warm, steady hand on his shoulder. You carry the voices of many today, she said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But remember, no matter what happens, you are enough. Jamal nodded, too choked up to speak. The weight of expectation, pride, and fear mixed into a knot in his stomach, but he knew he couldn't falter. Not now. The community center where the hearing was being held was already bustling when Jamal arrived. Reporters set up their cameras, flashes sparking like lightning as attendees filed in. The crowd was a patchwork of support and skepticism. Some wore badges that read, Justice for Jamal, while others had pins emblazoned with Protect Our Police. Mrs. Thompson was there, standing at the entrance and greeting people with nods and the occasional sharp look at those who glared too long. She saw Jamal and waved him over, her expression softening. You ready? She asked, her voice low. As ready as I'll ever be, Jamal said, forcing a small smile. They walked inside together, past murmuring groups and shifting gazes until they found seats near the front. Grandma Ella sat beside him, her posture regal and unyielding. The council members sat at a long, polished table at the front of the room, their faces a mix of concern, fatigue, and unreadable neutrality. Mayor Caldwell, presiding over the hearing, tapped his gavel twice, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. We are here today to address the incident involving Mr. Jamal Carter and Officer Barnes, as well as the broader issues that have arisen in our community, the mayor said. His voice carried a practiced authority, but even he seemed slightly taken aback by the size of the crowd. The police chief was called first. His uniform was crisp, the brass buttons polished to a shine. He delivered a statement that straddled the line between acknowledging community concerns and defending the department's reputation. We are committed to transparency, he said. The footage has been reviewed, and while there are aspects that raise concern, we must allow the investigation to conclude before drawing final conclusions. A murmur swept through the room, a collective reaction that spoke of mistrust and impatience. Next, it was Mrs. Thompson's turn. She walked to the podium with the confidence of someone who had seen too much to be afraid. I've lived in this town all my life, she began, her voice strong, and I've seen it change, for better and for worse. What happened to Jamal is part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. This town deserves better, and we're here to demand it. The room erupted into applause, silenced only when the mayor banged his gavel. Jamal felt his heart racing as his name was called. He stood, legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the podium. The microphone loomed before him, and for a moment the faces in the crowd blurred. Then he spotted Sarah near the back, giving him a small nod, and something clicked into place. When I was stopped that night, he began, his voice steadying, I did everything I was taught to do. I was respectful, I kept my hands visible, I stayed calm. But it wasn't enough. And that's why we're here. Not just for me, but for everyone who's felt powerless and unheard. He paused, scanning the room. Some faces were sympathetic, others skeptical, but all were listening. He continued, drawing strength from the silence. I don't hate the police, he said. I know many officers who do their job with fairness and kindness. But when trust is broken by someone like Officer Barnes, it hurts everyone, not just me. This is about making sure no one else has to stand here and explain why their dignity matters. When he stepped back, the silence was thicker, charged with emotion. The mayor nodded solemnly and spoke into the microphone. "Thank you, Jamal. We will take your words and the words of everyone here into consideration as we move forward." The aftermath of the hearing was immediate. News outlets covered Jamal's speech, calling it powerful, heartfelt, and necessary. Social media exploded with messages of support, stories of similar encounters from towns across the state, and a renewed call for police reform. But alongside the support came backlash. An anonymous account posted a video claiming Jamal was exaggerating for attention, using clips that painted Barnes as a decorated officer with a history of good deeds. The narrative of doubt spread quickly among those already skeptical. Jamal's phone buzzed with notifications, some kind, others filled with vitriol. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the wall of his room, the voices of doubt seeping into the cracks of his resolve. Just as the pressure threatened to drown him, a knock at his door jolted him back to the present. It was Sarah, her eyes serious but kind. "I thought you might need a friend," she said, holding up a bag of takeout from the diner. "And maybe some food." Jamal chuckled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Thanks, I could use both." They sat on the floor, eating and talking about everything except the hearing. School, music, future plans. For a while the world outside faded, replaced by laughter and stories. It reminded Jamal that his life was more than just this fight. It was also full of dreams that reached beyond it. "I'm proud of you, you know," Sarah said after a while, her tone shifting. "Not just for today, but for everything. It takes courage to stand up, especially when people are trying to push you down." Jamal met her eyes, the weight on his heart lifting, if only for a moment. "It's easier when I know I'm not alone." Days turned into weeks, and the council deliberated behind closed doors. The tension in town reached a breaking point when a local activist group organized a peaceful march, drawing hundreds to Main Street. The march was a tapestry of voices, young, old, black, white, all chanting in unison, "Justice! Trust! Change!" Jamal walked at the center, Grandma Ella at his side, her head held high. The march moved like a river, its current carrying stories, pain, and hope through the heart of Millstone. Banners waved above the crowd, reading messages like "Accountability for all" and "This is our town too." The sound of drums and chants reverberated through the narrow streets, mingling with the autumn air. At the end of the march, Reverend Collins took the makeshift stage set up in the town square and spoke with a voice that trembled with passion. "We are here because silence is no longer an option. We are here because our town, our children deserve better." The crowd roared in agreement. Jamal felt a rush of energy, the kind that comes from standing shoulder to shoulder with people who believe in the same cause. The fight was far from over, but they had already proven something important. Millstone was no longer a town willing to look the other way. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, Jamal sat on the porch of his grandmother's house. The town, which had felt divided and tense for so long, seemed different now. He looked out at the quiet street, knowing that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. And that was enough to give him hope. The next day, the morning air felt different. Jamal stood on his grandmother's porch, looking out at Millstone as the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops. The world seemed quieter, as if the town itself were taking a breath after the roar of the march. He could still feel the energy from last night, the warmth of unity and the determination that had flowed through the streets like a river. Grandma Ella stepped out to join him, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. She sipped quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "The council meets today to announce their decision," she said, not looking at him, but at some distant point beyond the trees. Jamal nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening. The council's decision could change everything, not just for him, but for the entire town. It would either validate their fight or push them back to the starting line. "We've done all we could," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "And it's enough," Grandma Ella replied, her voice steady. "No matter what happens, you've shown everyone what it means to stand up." The town square filled with people long before the council meeting began. News vans parked along the perimeter, reporters jostling for space to capture the moment. Jamal arrived with Sarah and Mrs. Thompson, weaving through the crowd that buzzed with anxious anticipation. Reverend Collins approached, his usual warm expression tempered by seriousness. "We're with you, Jamal," he said, gripping his shoulder firmly. The reassurance grounded Jamal, reminding him that he was part of something much bigger than himself. The council chamber doors opened, and the crowd surged forward. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest as he took a seat near the front, flanked by his grandmother and Sarah. The council members filed in, their faces unreadable, with Mayor Caldwell taking his place at the center. He tapped his gavel, the sharp sound slicing through the murmurs. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice resonating in the hushed room. "We have reviewed the evidence, listened to community input, and consulted with independent authorities. Today, we are here to deliver our findings and announce measures for moving forward." A collective breath held the room captive. "First," Mayor Caldwell continued, "Officer Barnes has been found in violation of departmental policy regarding excessive conduct during the incident involving Mr. Jamal Carter. Effective immediately, he will be terminated from his position with the Millstone Police Department." The room erupted, half with gasps and half with applause. Jamal felt Sarah's hand on his arm, squeezing in shared relief. Grandma Ella's eyes glistened, pride and emotion mixing in their depths. But the mayor wasn't finished. "In addition, we recognize that this incident reflects deeper issues within our law enforcement practices. Therefore, we are implementing mandatory training focused on de-escalation, bias awareness, and community engagement for all officers." Murmurs swept through the room, this time with a tone of cautious optimism. Reverend Collins nodded approvingly, his expression lightening. Jamal looked around, noting the subtle shift in posture among the crowd. Skeptics seemed thoughtful, supporters hopeful. It was a moment of potential transformation, fragile but real. The days that followed were a mix of celebration and reflection. Neighbors stopped by to shake Jamal's hand or offer kind words. At Emerson's Market, Mr. Emerson called out, "There's our young hero," as Jamal walked in, drawing chuckles from the regulars. But not everyone celebrated. Pockets of resistance lingered, their whispers laced with doubt and defiance. The tension didn't disappear overnight, but it had changed. It was no longer hidden, and that was a start. One evening, as Jamal and Sarah sat on the old swings at Millstone Park, the sun setting behind them, she turned to him. "How does it feel to know you've changed things?" He looked out at the familiar park, where memories of laughter and childhood games surfaced. "It feels surreal, but there's still so much more to do. This was just the beginning." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "Then we keep going." The council's decisions brought tangible change over the next few months. Officer training programs were rolled out, and town hall meetings became regular events where community members could voice their concerns. A civilian oversight committee was established to handle complaints and ensure transparency. Jamal became an unexpected spokesperson, invited to speak at schools and events. His story spread beyond Millstone, reaching neighboring towns and even earning coverage in statewide media. Letters poured in, some from people who shared their own experiences, others simply expressing support. One stood out from a boy named Caleb who wrote, "Because of you, I'm not as afraid to speak up anymore." That simple sentence stayed with Jamal, a reminder of why the fight had been worth it. But not every battle was won with a council decision or a speech. One day, as Jamal walked home from the community center, he noticed Officer Reyes waiting by the sidewalk. The younger officer nodded, an olive branch in his posture. "I wanted to thank you," Reyes said, his tone earnest. "Things are different at the station now. People are more aware, more careful. It's not perfect, but it's better." Jamal studied his face, searching for signs of insincerity and finding none. "I'm glad to hear that. Change takes time, I guess." It does, Reyes agreed. He hesitated before continuing. But it starts somewhere, and you gave us that start. The words sank in, carrying a weight Jamal hadn't anticipated. He realized then that change wasn't just about those who fought for it, but also about those who chose to accept it, to be better. It was a two-way street. Spring came to Millstone with an air of renewal. The town looked brighter. The tension that had once hung heavy now dispersed by cautious optimism. The Oversight Committee held its first meeting, chaired by Mrs. Thompson, who had become an unwavering force for fairness in the community. Jamal sat in the front row, taking notes as speakers discussed new policies, successes, and areas still in need of attention. Grandma Ella was beside him, her gaze fixed on the proceedings. She leaned over and whispered, "Your mother would be so proud." The words settled into his chest, warm and steady. He could almost feel his mother's presence, her quiet smile and gentle encouragement. It was a bittersweet moment, but it was one he cherished. The meeting concluded with applause, the sound echoing in the space where Jamal's journey had begun. As people filed out, Reverend Collins caught Jamal's eye and gave him a nod. "Keep going, Jamal," he said, his voice strong. "This is only the beginning." Jamal stepped outside into the crisp air, the sky a canvas of blue and white. He took a deep breath, the future wide open before him. The road had been rough, and it would likely stay that way for a while, but he wasn't alone. Millstone was changing, and he was part of that change, a reminder that sometimes standing up meant holding the line long enough for others to join you. With determination in his heart and the voices of those who believed in him echoing around him, Jamal took a step forward, ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the council's landmark decision were filled with a mix of quiet reflection and visible change. For the first time in years, Millstone seemed alive with a new kind of energy, one that buzzed in the conversations at Emerson's Market, echoed in the laughter of children playing in Millstone Park, and hummed in the quiet nods exchanged between neighbors. The town was changing slowly but undeniably. Jamal found himself at the center of this change, a reluctant but steadfast symbol of resilience. Invitations for interviews and speaking engagements came pouring in, not just from local organizations, but from larger cities and even state conferences on youth advocacy and community reform. Each invitation was a reminder that his voice now reached further than the boundaries of Millstone. One afternoon, as Jamal prepared notes for an upcoming speech at a nearby college, Mrs. Thompson stopped by Grandma Ella's house. She arrived with a stack of pamphlets about upcoming town initiatives and a clipboard full of signatures from community members eager to stay involved. Her eyes, always sharp, were softer as she sat at the kitchen table across from Jamal. "You know," she began, a rare smile forming on her lips, "I never thought I'd see the day where change felt this possible." Jamal set his pen down and looked up. "It's strange, isn't it? Sometimes it feels like it all happened overnight, and other times it feels like it took forever." "Change is like that," Mrs. Thompson said. She took a sip of the tea Grandma Ella had set out, letting its warmth spread through her. "But remember, Jamal, there's always work left to do. Progress invites resistance, and we'll need to be ready for that." Her words rang true. Despite the significant strides the town had made, there were still moments that reminded Jamal of the challenges that lay ahead. He would walk past certain storefronts and catch snippets of conversations, murmurs of frustration from those who believed the council's decision had gone too far, or whispers about moving away to avoid what they called a new Millstone. One such moment came during a meeting at the police station. The new Community Oversight Committee had requested to sit down with the department to discuss further reforms and build trust. Jamal attended as an observer, invited by Mrs. Thompson. The room was filled with a mix of committee members, officers, and a few new recruits who had joined the force after Barnes's departure. Tensions simmered beneath the polite exchanges, especially when discussions turned to the implementation of new training programs. Officer Reyes, who had spoken to Jamal weeks earlier, was one of the few who looked relaxed. He voiced his support, emphasizing the importance of bridging the gap between the department and the people they served. But there were others, older officers whose expressions hardened with each proposal. One of them, a burly man named Officer Pratt, spoke up. "All this training and oversight is fine in theory," he said, his voice deep and tinged with resentment. "But let's not pretend it's going to solve every problem. We can't do our jobs if we're too worried about what the public thinks of every move we make." Mrs. Thompson didn't miss a beat. "Accountability doesn't prevent you from doing your job, Officer Pratt. It makes sure you do it well." A silence followed, tense but necessary. Jamal felt a spark of hope ignite as he watched Officer Reyes nod in agreement. Change was uncomfortable, but it was happening. The impact of Millstone's journey began to ripple outwards. Calls came in from other towns asking for advice on how to start similar initiatives. A reporter from a major newspaper reached out for an in-depth piece on Millstone's transformation, spotlighting Jamal and other key figures like Mrs. Thompson and Reverend Collins. The story of how a single encounter had sparked widespread reform resonated beyond the town's borders. Jamal met with leaders from other communities, sharing his experience and listening to theirs. He attended a forum in a neighboring city where high school students shared stories of their own run-ins with law enforcement and spoke about how they felt inspired by Millstone's example. One student, a girl named Kara with curly hair and wide, hopeful eyes, approached him after the event. "Your story gave me the courage to talk to my principal about starting a student advocacy group at my school," she said, holding a notebook covered in stickers that read, "Speak Up" and "Youth Power." Jamal felt a surge of pride. "That's amazing, Kara. Keep pushing, even when it feels hard. You're already making a difference." Back in Millstone, life found a new kind of rhythm. Jamal's schedule was filled with speaking engagements, committee meetings, and school assignments. He found solace in simple moments, studying on the back porch, listening to Grandma Ella hum old gospel tunes, or catching up with Sarah at the park after long days. Their friendship had deepened, forged in the fire of shared struggle. Sarah often teased him about his growing fame, but her eyes shone with pride. One evening, as they sat under the stars, she said, "You know, it's not just the speeches or the news articles that people remember. It's that you showed them it's okay to be afraid and still stand up anyway." Jamal looked at her, the moonlight casting silver shadows across her face. "I never thought I'd be here," he admitted. "But I'm glad I am." "Me too," she said, her voice soft. The road to change, however, was far from smooth. A month after the council's decision, a new incident shook the community. A scuffle broke out at the local fair, and rumors spread like wildfire about police overreaction. Jamal received calls from worried neighbors and messages from friends asking if he knew what had happened. He met with Mrs. Thompson and Reverend Collins to discuss how to approach the situation. "We need to gather facts before jumping to conclusions," Reverend Collins advised. "But we also need to remind the community that this is why we pushed for oversight in the first place." The Oversight Committee convened an emergency session with representatives from the police department present. This time there was more cooperation. Officer Reyes stood by his commitment to transparency, offering details about the department's response and acknowledging that mistakes had been made. It was a difficult meeting, full of tense exchanges and emotional testimonies from those who had witnessed the incident. But it ended with a plan, a renewed commitment to training and an open forum for the public to express concerns. When the forum was held at the community center, Jamal took the stage to address the crowd. "Accountability isn't a one-time thing," he said. "It's a continuous process, and it only works if we hold each other to it, both as a community and as individuals." The crowd listened, some nodding, others crossing their arms with skeptical frowns. But Jamal could see something had shifted. People were talking, engaging, not just standing on opposite sides of an invisible line. Months turned into a year, and Millstone's story continued to evolve. The town became known as a model of how grassroots activism could lead to meaningful reform. The Oversight Committee published its first annual report, highlighting improvements and acknowledging areas that still needed work. Jamal stood with the committee as they presented their findings to the community. The room was filled with familiar faces: Mrs. Thompson with her unwavering gaze, Reverend Collins with a proud smile, and Sarah, who now worked part-time at the community center while studying sociology at the nearby college. Grandma Ella sat in the front row, beaming with pride as Jamal spoke. "This past year has shown us that change isn't a moment. It's a movement," he said. "It's something we have to nurture and protect day by day." After the presentation, people lingered, sharing stories and making plans. Jamal felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Caleb, the boy who had sent him the letter months earlier. He was older now, taller, and his eyes shone with admiration. "I wanted to tell you in person," Caleb said. "I joined the school debate team, and we're working on a project about community and justice. I never would have done it if I hadn't heard your story." Jamal's throat tightened with emotion. He reached out to shake Caleb's hand. "You're going to do great things, Caleb. Keep going." As the sun set over Millstone that evening, casting the town in hues of gold and rose, Jamal stood on the hill overlooking the park where so much had started. The journey had been painful and challenging, filled with moments that tested his spirit and the town's resolve. But as he watched the lights flicker on, illuminating the pathways where children played and neighbors talked, he knew the fight had been worth it. Millstone wasn't perfect. It wasn't without its divides or its skeptics, but it was stronger, more open, and more aware than it had been before. And as Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, he understood that change was never truly done. It was always unfolding, shaped by those brave enough to push it forward. He turned away from the view and headed home, ready to face whatever the future held. The road ahead would have its challenges, but now, more than ever, Jamal knew he could meet them, with his community by his side. The following months brought a new rhythm to Millstone. The town's heart beat with a cautious hope, stitched together by the stories of its people and the determined efforts of those who refused to let their hard-won progress unravel. Jamal Carter found himself at the center of this pulse, navigating a life that had become both familiar and changed in profound ways. Jamal's voice, once timid in the face of power, had become a beacon not just in Millstone, but in nearby towns that looked to their neighbor as a symbol of transformation. He spoke at regional conferences and schools, sharing what Millstone had learned and the challenges they still faced. Each time he stood before a crowd, the weight of expectation settled on him, but it was a weight he carried willingly. One spring afternoon, Jamal received a letter from the State Office of Community Engagement. They had taken notice of Millstone's reforms and invited him to join a youth advisory board focused on bridging gaps between law enforcement and local communities. The offer felt monumental, a chance to make a difference on a larger scale, but it also came with apprehension. Jamal worried about balancing this new role with his commitments to his town, his studies, and the responsibilities he felt toward those who had supported him. "Grandma, they want me to represent Millstone at the state level," Jamal said one evening as they sat on the porch. The sunset painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Grandma Ella's eyes crinkled with pride. "You've been given a gift, Jamal. It's not just your voice they're listening to, it's the voices of everyone who's ever felt powerless. Don't let fear make you question it." Her words, as always, were exactly what he needed to hear. With a renewed sense of purpose, he accepted the invitation and prepared to step into the next phase of his journey. The first meeting of the Youth Advisory Board was held in the state capitol, a bustling city that seemed worlds away from the quiet streets of Millstone. The board consisted of students, young professionals, and community advocates from different backgrounds, all eager to contribute their experiences and ideas. Jamal quickly found common ground with many of them, sharing stories of resilience and the importance of community-driven change. One of the board members, Marcus, was a charismatic college senior from a neighboring town who had led protests following an incident of racial profiling at his university. "I read about what you did in Millstone," Marcus said during a break, leaning against a railing overlooking the city skyline. "It's inspiring to see that kind of change. We need more stories like yours to remind people that it's possible." Jamal felt a flicker of pride and gratitude. "We've come a long way, but it wasn't easy," he admitted. "And there's still so much left to do." Marcus nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "That's why we're here, to make sure the momentum keeps going." The board's discussions were intense, filled with debates about policy recommendations and strategies for community engagement. Jamal's experience in Millstone gave him a unique perspective that others valued. He spoke about the importance of trust and transparency and shared the lessons learned from Millstone's Oversight Committee. One afternoon, during a session focused on the role of education in preventing bias, a representative from the state police force joined the discussion. The room quieted as Captain Roberts, a seasoned officer with a reputation for honesty, addressed them. "We want to work with you, not against you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years in service. "But we need to hear what's missing from our approach. What would have helped build trust in your communities?" Jamal raised his hand, a move that felt almost instinctive now. "It starts with listening, Captain," he said, meeting the officer's gaze. "Not just in meetings like this, but on the ground. People need to see officers as allies, not enforcers." The captain nodded, and a discussion ensued that carried on until dusk, marked by candid stories and shared hopes for a better future. Back in Millstone, the town continued to adapt to the changes initiated by the Oversight Committee. Officer training sessions became regular events, and new recruits were paired with community mentors to foster relationships that went beyond badges and uniforms. Mrs. Thompson, now a respected local figure beyond the town, often sat in on these sessions, offering her insights and keeping the spirit of accountability alive. Sarah, who had taken on more responsibilities at the community center, spearheaded a youth outreach program that encouraged dialogue between students and officers. The initiative, named Building Bridges, included monthly forums and joint volunteer projects. The first project involved cleaning up Millstone Park and planting trees along its walking paths. Jamal joined Sarah and a group of teenagers one Saturday afternoon, digging holes for the saplings while sharing stories and laughter. Officer Reyes showed up, shovel in hand, ready to help. His presence, once met with skepticism, was now greeted with nods and friendly chatter. "Looks like you've got quite the green thumb, Jamal," Reyes joked as they worked side by side. Jamal grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Don't get used to it. I'm more comfortable with speeches than shovels." Their banter felt natural, a sign of how far things had come. But Jamal knew better than to believe that every issue had been resolved. The town's progress was real, but it was still fragile, held together by the dedication of those who refused to let it falter. One evening, as Jamal walked home after a late committee meeting, the past caught up with him in an unexpected way. He passed the old playground where he used to play basketball with his friends, a place now empty under the dim glow of the streetlights. The memory of that night, the flashing lights, Officer Barnes's harsh voice, the fear that had gripped him, resurfaced, sharp and vivid. The memory was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Jamal turned to see an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes standing a few paces away. It was Mr. Harlan, a longtime Millstone resident known for keeping to himself. "I watched what you did, boy, Mr. Harlan said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Didn't think I'd live to see someone stand up like that." Jamal blinked, surprised by the encounter. "Thank you, sir." "Mr. Harlan nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "You keep doing what you're doing. Don't let the past hold you back." As the man walked away, Jamal felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, hope, and the recognition that even those who stayed silent were paying attention. The year ended with a town hall meeting that felt different from the others. The community gathered not to confront or question, but to celebrate what they had achieved and discuss where to go next. Mrs. Thompson spoke first, recounting the milestones reached and the work still to come. Reverend Collins offered a prayer of gratitude and hope, his voice rich with emotion. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he stood before a room full of people who had become more than neighbors. They were part of a shared story. "This isn't the end of what we started," he said. "It's just the beginning. We've shown that change is possible, but now we have to make sure it lasts." The applause that followed was warm, a collective embrace of everything they had endured and built together. After the meeting, Jamal stepped outside into the crisp winter air. Sarah joined him, her breath visible in the cold night. "You did good," she said, bumping his shoulder lightly. "Thanks," Jamal said, exhaling. He looked out at the town, the lights twinkling like stars. "It feels like we're finally moving forward." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with conviction. "Because we are." And as Jamal stood there, surrounded by the familiar and the new, he felt a sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but they were walking it together, and that made all the difference. As Jamal juggled his role on the State Youth Advisory Board with his community work, invitations began to flood in from across the state. High schools and colleges requested him as a guest speaker, while community organizations sought his advice on building trust between citizens and law enforcement. His once quiet life in Millstone had turned into a series of packed schedules and travel plans, but he embraced it. Each trip and each speech was a reminder of how far he had come, and how far he could go. One of the most significant events was an invitation to the state capitol, where he would speak alongside Governor Marshall at a conference on youth leadership and community reform. It was the largest platform he had ever been offered, and the weight of it sat heavy on his shoulders. Sarah noticed the strain in his expression one evening as they met at Millstone Park. "You're overthinking it," she said, sitting cross-legged on the grass beside him. "You always do that when you're nervous." Jamal smiled, a hint of sheepishness crossing his face. "It's just, this is bigger than anything I've done. What if I mess up?" "You won't," Sarah said firmly. "You know why? Because you're not doing this alone. You've got everyone here behind you, and whatever happens, they'll be proud of you." Her words settled the storm in his mind, if only slightly. He reached out, squeezing her hand. "Thanks. I needed that." The day of the conference arrived, and Jamal stood backstage in a grand hall filled with rows of chairs, polished wooden panels, and chandeliers that cast light in intricate patterns. The sound of hundreds of people chatting filled the space, but he focused on the rhythmic beat of his own heart. Governor Marshall, a tall man with a commanding presence and kind eyes, approached Jamal with a reassuring nod. "You're up next," he said. "Speak from the heart, and they'll listen." As Jamal stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He scanned the sea of faces, students, activists, officials, journalists, all waiting for him to speak. "I'm here today because of a journey that started in a small town called Millstone," he began, his voice clear and steady. "A place where one night changed everything for me, and set in motion a movement that continues to shape who we are as a community." He spoke about courage, unity, and the challenges they had faced. But he also talked about resilience and the importance of not becoming complacent once the first signs of change appear. The room was quiet, attentive, and when he finished, the applause was thunderous. Later, Governor Marshall approached him again. "You did more than speak today, Jamal," he said. "You inspired." Jamal's speech was shared online, drawing attention from communities that were struggling with similar issues. Letters and emails poured in from people who saw Millstone's story as a blueprint for their own battles. The town itself became a symbol of what was possible when a community rallied around justice and reform. One such message came from the mayor of a neighboring town, Middleton, where tensions between the police and the public had been simmering. Mayor Thompson requested a visit from Jamal and members of Millstone's Oversight Committee to discuss potential initiatives. The trip to Middleton was eye-opening. Unlike Millstone, where reform had taken hold after months of persistence, Middleton was at the beginning of its journey. Jamal, along with Mrs. Thompson and Officer Reyes, who had become a prominent supporter of community engagement, met with local leaders and concerned citizens. The discussions were raw, filled with stories of fear and mistrust, but also hope. Mrs. Thompson, with her years of wisdom, spoke eloquently. "The first step is acknowledging that the path forward won't be easy. But if you're willing to work together, to listen to each other, real change can happen." Jamal shared Millstone's story, emphasizing the importance of unity and the role young voices played in pushing for progress. He saw reflections of himself in the young faces that listened, eager and uncertain, but ready to act. Back in Millstone, the town was thriving under new initiatives. The Building Bridges project, led by Sarah, grew to include mentorship programs where teenagers were paired with community leaders and police officers for volunteer work and dialogue sessions. These interactions allowed students to see officers as people, individuals with families, fears, and hopes of their own. One such pairing stood out. Caleb, the boy who had once sent Jamal that heartfelt letter, was matched with Officer Daniels, a middle-aged man known for his no-nonsense demeanor. At first, their meetings were awkward, filled with stilted conversations and polite nods. But over time, as they worked on a project repainting the community center's walls, their conversations shifted from forced to genuine. "I didn't always want to be a cop," Officer Daniels admitted one afternoon, dipping his brush into a can of blue paint. "My dad was a firefighter, and I thought I'd follow in his footsteps. But life had other plans." Caleb paused mid-stroke, surprise flashing across his face. "What changed?" Daniels shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I realized that protecting people comes in different forms. But that doesn't mean I get it right all the time. That's why projects like this matter. They remind me who I'm really here for." Jamal, who had stopped by to see their progress, watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. It was these moments, small but significant, that confirmed that Millstone was truly changing. Not everything was smooth sailing. New challenges arose as Millstone's story gained recognition. Some outsiders questioned whether the town's reforms could be sustained or if they were just a temporary fix. News outlets ran stories with headlines like, "Millstone's Model of Reform, Can It Last?" These doubts seeped into the town, reigniting old fears and sparking debates at town meetings. One meeting turned particularly heated when a resident named Mr. Calloway, known for his outspoken skepticism, stood up. "What happens when the spotlight fades?" he demanded. "Are we just going to go back to how things were, or are these changes real?" Jamal stood to respond, his voice firm but calm. "Change isn't something that's finished. It's something we have to keep working at every day. It's not about the spotlight, it's about what we choose to do when no one's watching." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Slowly, heads nodded, and the conversation moved forward, more constructive than before. The town's progress brought together people of different ages and backgrounds, fostering connections that hadn't existed before. Jamal's grandmother, Ella, became a fixture at community events, sharing stories from her youth and reminding younger generations of the long history of resilience they were building on. One evening, as she spoke at a storytelling event at the community center, she recounted tales of Millstone's past. "We've always been a town of fighters," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "We fought through tough times, through loss, and through silence. But now we're learning to fight together, and that's the greatest change of all." Jamal listened from the back of the room, the words resonating in a way that felt personal. The battles they faced were not new, but the way they were fighting them was. As summer approached, Jamal found himself with a rare evening free. He walked to the hill overlooking Millstone Park, where the lights of the town twinkled below. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the distant murmur of crickets. Sarah joined him, a quiet presence that needed no invitation. "Thinking about everything that's happened?" she asked, her tone light but understanding. "Yeah," Jamal admitted, a soft smile crossing his face. "It's been a lot." "It has," she agreed, nudging his shoulder. "But look at what's changed. Look at what you helped change." They sat in companionable silence, the past year playing out in their minds like a film. The struggles, the victories, the moments of doubt, they were all part of a journey that was still unfolding. And while the road ahead was uncertain, it was filled with the promise of continued strength, unity, and hope. Summer settled over Millstone with the lazy warmth of golden afternoons and long evenings where the air hummed with life. The town, once marked by tension and whispered doubts, now buzzed with the chatter of community meetings, youth programs, and shared meals on front porches. But beneath the surface, the undercurrents of change required vigilance. Jamal Carter found himself busier than ever, balancing his role on the State Youth Advisory Board, speaking engagements, and the continuous work with Millstone's Oversight Committee. The days blended together, filled with meetings that ran long into the night and moments of reflection that carved out quiet pockets in his otherwise hectic schedule. A new project was on the horizon. The state government, inspired by Millstone's success, proposed a pilot program that would integrate the town's reform model into 5 other communities. The program, dubbed Echoes of Unity, was ambitious, aiming to replicate the Oversight Committee model, youth outreach programs, and de-escalation training workshops. Jamal was invited to co-lead the initiative alongside Marcus, his peer from the State Advisory Board. One afternoon, as Jamal walked through Millstone Park on his way to a planning meeting, he saw Sarah leading a group of kids through an art project. They were painting murals on large wooden panels that would be displayed around town. Each mural depicted moments of strength, hope, and unity, snapshots of the journey that had transformed Millstone. "Hey, Jamal!" Sarah called out, a paint-splattered smile lighting up her face. "Come join us!" He laughed, shaking his head. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be covered in paint today." "Too late," she said, flicking a speck of blue paint at him with a playful grin. The kids giggled as Jamal dodged, the moment filling him with warmth. He felt the weight of responsibility ease for a second, replaced by the simple joy of community. Jamal's work with the Echoes of Unity project took him to different towns, where he shared Millstone's story and listened to the unique challenges faced by other communities. Each place had its own history, its own pains, and its own hopes. In Pinecrest, a town known for its once thriving steel industry, Jamal met a former union leader named Mr. Alvarez. "Millstone's story gives us hope," Mr. Alvarez said, his voice gravelly with age but strong. "Our fight is different, but it's good to know we're not alone." Jamal nodded, feeling the familiar surge of empathy and determination. "Every town has its fight. We're here to learn how we can stand with you, not just bring what we've done." The meetings were a blend of emotions, hope, skepticism, and a cautious willingness to try. The idea of change was daunting to some, inspiring to others. But Jamal's approach of listening and adapting rather than dictating allowed for real conversations. It was during these exchanges that he realized the importance of sharing not just successes, but mistakes, of showing that the path to reform was never without setbacks. Back in Millstone, Grandma Ella became a source of wisdom for more than just Jamal. She started hosting porch talks, weekly gatherings where anyone from the community could come, sit with her on the old rocking chairs, and listen to stories of resilience and perseverance. The talks soon grew in popularity, drawing everyone from teenagers seeking direction to older residents who hadn't felt connected to the town's youth in years. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the porch in warm shadows, Jamal sat beside his grandmother and watched as people arrived. Caleb was there, a notebook in hand, ready to jot down anything that resonated. Mrs. Thompson sat nearby, her eyes bright with curiosity, while Officer Reyes leaned against the railing, absorbing the scene with quiet respect. "Tonight," Grandma Ella began, "I want to talk about strength. Not the kind that shows up in muscles or loud words, but the kind that holds steady when the storm comes." She spoke of the town's history, of times when the mill shut down and families struggled to find work, of protests long forgotten where voices had called out for fairness and decency. Her words painted pictures of perseverance, of people standing together even when the odds seemed insurmountable. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before Caleb spoke up, his voice hesitant but clear. "How do you know when it's time to keep pushing, even when it feels like nothing's changing?" Grandma Ella's eyes softened as she looked at him. "When you know that stopping means accepting less than what's right. That's when you push, even if it's just one step at a time." Jamal felt a lump in his throat, the truth of her words settling in deeply. The journey wasn't just about what they had accomplished. It was about every small step they still needed to take. Just as the Echoes of Unity program began to gain traction, a new challenge arose. A report surfaced that called into question some of the Oversight Committee's practices. Though the accusations were based on misunderstandings and incomplete data, they spread quickly, stoking old fears and creating new doubts. The town hall meeting called to address the report was packed. Jamal stood at the front, flanked by Mrs. Thompson and Reverend Collins, their faces a mix of calm resolve and determination. "We're here because transparency matters," Jamal began, meeting the eyes of the audience. "Our work has never been perfect, and we're not afraid to admit that. But what we can't let happen is for fear to take away what we've built together." A voice called out from the back. It was Mr. Calloway, the skeptic who had once questioned whether the town's changes were real. "How do we know this isn't just talk? How do we know the Oversight Committee isn't just another way to make things look good without real accountability?" Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice steady. "Because you're here, asking that question, Mr. Calloway. And because we're here, willing to answer it. This committee exists to listen, to adapt, and to keep working. Not to claim we've solved everything, but to make sure we don't stop trying." The room held its breath. "Slowly, Mr. Calloway nodded, a look of reluctant understanding crossing his face. The tension eased, replaced by the recognition that progress meant facing doubt head-on, without flinching. As the months passed, the youth programs flourished. Caleb, now a leader in the Building Bridges project, spearheaded an art exhibit that showcased the murals from their summer project and photographs depicting moments of Millstone's journey. The exhibit, held in the town library, drew visitors from neighboring towns and was featured in the local news. Jamal watched with pride as Caleb spoke to a reporter, recounting how the community had come together and how those moments had changed him. It was a reminder that the seeds they'd planted were taking root, growing into something strong and enduring. Sarah, too, was expanding her vision. She proposed a mentorship exchange program that would partner Millstone students with peers from other towns involved in the Echoes of Unity project. The goal was to create a network of youth leaders who could share experiences, learn from one another, and build resilience. The first exchange brought students from Pinecrest to Millstone, where they participated in workshops, discussions, and activities aimed at fostering understanding. One evening, as they gathered around a bonfire at Millstone Park, stories were shared, some filled with laughter, others with tears. Jamal listened, feeling the power of connection and the way it could bridge gaps that once seemed insurmountable. The year drew to a close with a sense of cautious optimism. Millstone had not just weathered its storms, it had learned to navigate them with a collective strength that was now woven into the fabric of the town. Jamal stood on the stage of the community center, addressing the crowd at the annual town celebration. The room was filled with faces old and new, all reflecting the story of a town that had chosen to stand together. The applause that followed his speech was not just for him, but for everyone who had played a part, big or small. As the night unfolded, music filled the hall, and people danced and shared stories. Grandma Ella sat in her favorite chair, watching with a satisfied smile. Mrs. Thompson moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with warmth, while Caleb and Sarah talked animatedly with a group of visiting students. Jamal found himself standing by the window, looking out at the town bathed in the glow of lights and laughter. Sarah appeared beside him, bumping his shoulder. "You're doing that thing again," she teased. "What thing?" "Thinking about everything at once," she said, her eyes bright with affection. "You can take a breath, you know. You've earned it." Jamal chuckled, feeling the tension in his shoulders release. "Maybe you're right." As the celebration continued behind them, Jamal looked out at Millstone, the town that had become more than just home. It was a testament to the power of unity, a story of what could happen when a community chose to fight not against itself, but for each other. And for the first time in a long while, Jamal allowed himself to believe that the future, though still uncertain, was one worth stepping into with hope.